Yeah, so Nisi is a Latin term. Basically, you're setting forth conditions and you have these conditions and less. And so I look at wine as well, when we approach a vintage, we kind of have in our head this idea that this, I'd say, loose contract almost of the type of wine you want to make. Unless Mother Nature comes, you gotta pick a little early or, there could be outside circumstances. Maybe even your barrels didn't get delivered on time. I think that's something about wine production that really gets lost in the story is we always talk about, oh, how perfect the vintage was. Oh, the wines, just kind of developed and, there was struggle, but there's so many moving parts. And I wanted to capture that in a way of like, yeah, we're constantly having to adapt and adjust and make decisions that ultimately affect the outcome of the wine. And so that's where Nisi comes from. And what I do like to say is when I make a wine where everything goes perfectly, where truly in nice eye, I will retire. Meaning the grapes just are ready to go, they ferment, everything's perfect, and I don't have to do anything. Yeah, I'll retire.
People look back at those vintages that are like absolutely perfect. But the reality is that there was chaos all around. Welcome everybody back to the Barrels and Roots podcast. I am still your host, Sean Trace. I hope I will be as tomorrow as well, but since it's my podcast, I'm pretty sure I will be. Yay! I have an awesome guest with me today. Would you like to tell people who you are and what you do?
Awesome. Well, Sean, thanks for having me on. I'm Adam Edelman. I make wine, as I think many of your guests do. And yeah, my brand is called Nisi Wines, and I'm relatively new in the wine world. My first vintage was 2024.
Nice. How did you get started down this journey of making wine?
By chance.
Okay.
I'm originally from Connecticut. I just on a whim decided to move out to Napa Valley for a harvest internship, and that was a little bit over a decade. My background is actually neuroscience and philosophy. So with my brand, you'll definitely see some elements of that background. So I don't just do wine; I do think a lot. And
Mm,
but yeah, I just decided one day it was like, let me attempt to harvest. Did not know what I was getting myself into and did not know what journey lied ahead, but here I am.
that's awesome. That's awesome, man. It's interesting. It's cool to see people with diverse backgrounds coming to the field because I mean, I studied Eastern philosophy and in university. I was a history major, but I specialized in Eastern philosophy. I love Buddhism and Taoism and Chan Buddhism, which was like the precursor to Zen. And I moved to Asia to kind of see that in action. And, that was one of the reasons I'm still here in Vietnam was because one thing led to another, which led to another, which led to another. But those are kind of the best things in life, those things that kind of take you in that non-linear path, kind of this winding path. But it's interesting here to tell you I could have conversations with you for days. One of my favorite books is this book called The Practical Neuroscience of Buddhism. And it's like the Buddha's brain. And it's just goes on and on about all of these wonderful things. But one of the things that I've always found is that there are so many times in philosophy and literature that people talk about wine, talk about it being one of these really special things that allows people to find a level of truth. And so it's interesting to hear you finding your truth through this.
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of those things where initially I felt that wine was not me, let's say, practicing what I call neurophilosophy. And then I
Mhm.
realized, oh, wait, it is neurophilosophy.
That's interesting. What does before we get into I made a list of questions that I want to ask you, but what does the name for your wine come from? What was the inspiration for that?
Yeah, so Nisi is a Latin term. Basically, you're setting forth conditions and you have these conditions and less. And
Mm,
so I look at wine as well, when we approach a vintage, we kind of have in our head this idea that this, I'd say, loose contract almost of the type of wine you want to make.
mhm.
Unless Mother
Mhm.
Nature comes, you gotta pick a little early or, there could be outside circumstances. Maybe even your barrels didn't get delivered on time. I think that's something about wine production that really gets lost in the story is we always talk about, oh, how perfect the vintage was. Oh, the wines, just kind of developed and, there was struggle, but there's so many moving parts. And I wanted to capture that in a way of like, yeah, we're constantly having to adapt and adjust and make decisions that ultimately affect the outcome of the wine. And so that's where Nisi comes from. And what I do like to say is when I make a wine where everything goes perfectly, where truly in thy eye, I will retire. Meaning the grapes just are ready to go, they ferment, everything's perfect, and I don't have to do anything. Yeah, I'll retire.
That's wild, man. You talk about the people look back at those vintages that are, like, absolutely perfect, but the reality is that there was chaos all around, and yet it was one of the things that fascinates me the most are Stradivarius violins. The Stradivarius violins now we look as probably the finest instruments ever made, and due to the craftsmanship of Stradivarius himself, but also there was another thing, and people don't realize this, that in Europe, before Stradivarius was making the violins, there was a mini ice age. The planet cooled to a degree, and that cooling led to a density in the wood that was different than in warmer seasons. The trees were not growing as much. In those cold seasons, they grew very little. And so the layers of the wood were very tight, very, very tight. And those trees that were harvested at that time that became these violins were actually the mix of perfect conditions of nature, of a craftsman that was doing their thing. And just it was just this perfect moment, and it's like it's so beautiful to see because one of the things that I see now is I'm a photographer and I love taking photos with film and analog, and I'm just lucky 90% of the time. That 10% of that skill is like I get to know how to adjust certain buttons and knobs, and then I press a button and I try to put myself in the right place, and I still have to be bold, I still have to be confident, I still have to go, I'm going to take this photo, but literally 90% I'm not creating the light. I am not the one who created the way light bounces or shadows move. And certainly we can manipulate those, but still, even that, it's like 90% is things outside of my control. And that's the beauty of it all. You're still doing this dance with the elements that I think is very much a part of winemaking.
Yeah, 100%. There's a lot of skill, there's a lot of science. I'm very numbers driven in my winemaking. A lot of it is feeling.
Mm.
You can have all the numbers in the world, but end of the day, you got to trust your palate, got to trust your nose, and sometimes it's just your intuition. So you're taking in all these different bits of information, and then you got to make a
Mhm.
decision. And I think that's
Yes.
something that is so human about the winemaking process. And as we get further and further into AI becoming more and more a part of our daily lives, it's something we
Yep.
think about a lot in the wine industries. How is AI going to influence wine? I do feel there's a lot it can help with operationally speaking. I mean, it's winemaking is very physical and manual, so that's definitely way down the line. But in terms of decision making, it would be so hard to create a model that could make the same decision, for example, that I would make. And as many other winemakers would make, because and I've worked under, a number of phenomenal winemakers. And my goal as their assistant was to try to think like them, was to say, okay, if I'm making that decision like they would, what would they do? And sometimes,
Right.
or most of the time I would be close because, studied them. I was like, okay, gotta be on point here. It's not my wine, it's their wine. But other times it was like, yeah, Adam, I like where your thought is, but in this circumstance, you gotta think about that. And I was like, oh, yeah, I was too conservative. You bring up a good point. Now for my winemaking, I'm, completely in the driver's seat. So then it's all, I'm the one truly making that decision, but there's so much that goes into it that I might not even make the same decision from one week to the next week. It's like what I saw on that specific day. Let's say I was out in the field and called a pick. I was like, okay, it was intuition, it was, taste, it was numbers, it was looking at the weather, and then it was
100%.
just, it felt right.
It felt right. I love that, and you never know. The scientific side goes this way, the philosophical side pulls you this way at times as well, but, it leads to one of my questions, like, when you think back to the beginning of your wine journey, what was the moment that made you realize wine could be more than just a job? It could be your life's craft.
I love this question because my answer is very simple. When I realized I was having fun, and that is a privilege to do something and enjoy it. And that's where, when I say, wine to me is neurophilosophy, it is that intersection of science and art where I'm able to utilize, a lot of, numbers and data and chemistry. But then there's the other side of it where it's the kind of philosophy, the art, the intuition, the feeling. And I realized, and this happened to me when I was still working, in cellars, as an employee. It was like, oh, I have fun doing these jobs. Like, oh, there's no better feeling than opening up a barrel and getting to top that with wine, but smelling that aroma, those aromas. You realize, okay, I'm doing a task. There's a reason behind the task, which is scientifically driven, but there's a feeling that I'm getting while doing the task. And I was like, this is fun. And obviously, you get paid, so you feel good about that. And then I started to just keep making connections as to, via tasting, in the wineries I was working at, tasting other, wines throughout the world, kind of understanding the global perspective of wine. And I'm just someone who just gets really into things. And I got like obsessed. And so I was like, this is fun. I'm obsessed. My world is wine. All I think about. It's all I talk about, really. And I have fun doing it. And that's when I was like, yeah, that's the right path for me.
It's interesting too because sometimes you just know, and it's like that thing that clicks, but I love that you talk about fun. My daughter goes to a public school here in Vietnam, and the education is exceptional, but it's not fun. It's never been fun. I was really blown away by some of the holes in her mathematics, and she was doing well on her exams and such, but it was like there was stress every time we tried to review the homework. She was overwhelmed, and I noticed this pattern that it wasn't fun. So I went online and I went on Fiverr actually, which is like a freelancing website, to see if I could find a math tutor. And that's not normally where you find a math tutor on Fiverr, but I met this teacher from Malaysia. We went through all these, and there were so many wonderful people from all over the world. Bunch from India, Pakistan, but in this one teacher we found was so lovely. She's from Malaysia, but she lives in Sweden now. But she started working with my daughter to see the joy, to see the light shining on her face when this teacher made something fun. I had a guest onto my one of my podcasts that he talked about joy, and he's like, I don't buy into the whole stoic thing. Like, he's like, I don't think that we should just, deal with suffering and just suck it up. This is the way it's going to be. I'm going to suffer and work through it. He's like, I think we really should be seeking out joy in our life, seeking out the things that bring us light and make us happy. He's like, because those things we create a better product from, and we can show off things that, we really are passionate about. And it just was something that when I saw my daughter there and she turned to me and she's like, I got her 2 days with this math tutor online. And she's like, can I study 3? And I was like, wow, my daughter just asked if she could do more math. I never thought I'd be able to get that to happen in my life, but it was from that feeling of joy. And it's about being around people that can help us find that, or things that help us find that. I want to ask that too, because you've worked a lot of different roles across the wine world. What lessons from those earlier chapters most shaped the kind of winemaker you are today?
Yeah, I think I've been very fortunate to get a wide range of experiences, which gives me a pretty full toolbox. And that allows me as a winemaker to kind of not be, a one trick pony, but have a lot of knowledge of different ways to do it. So that, okay, well, when I was working for that winemaker, we did it this way. When I was working for that winemaker, it was that way. What resonates with me most? That kind of influences a lot of my decisions. I guess it was important for me that I got to experience all these different styles because I didn't study viticulture and enology. I had to basically create a concept in my mind of understanding, so initially the first couple harvests, it was just learning the how, let's just say like how to drive a forklift. It's like that's a skill. Racking barrels, there is a skill to it. Cleaning in a winery, I mean, you
Mhm.
could think you know how to scrub a tank. When you get into a tank and actually scrub it, it's different. Then you start understanding, why are you doing it? Okay, why do we need these tanks so clean? And so you go from the how to the why, and then you go from, okay, well, what is my goal? What is my ultimate goal as a winemaker? What type of wine am I trying to make? And so then I am able to look at all those different winemaking styles I worked under and be like, well, they were making wine in that style. I appreciate what they do, but that's not the style of wine that I like to make or I want to make. And so, like I say, I can take some of that, but ultimately, if I do everything, for example, let's talk about oak usage. If I mimic a lot of the winemakers I've worked under, that's a heavy percentage of new oak, and that doesn't necessarily work with the type of grapes I work with, which is Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and this type of
Mhm.
wine I try to make. So, as much as I love new oak, just getting to work with those barrels, they're kind of just like some of the most interesting aromatics comes from when you fill a new barrel. I mean, it's just like getting to
Really?
do that. You're like, this is incredible. What it impacts and leaves the imprint it leaves on the wine, that's a lot. And so the wine that I make, I'm like, okay, I need to be gentle. So my new oak percentage is lower. That being said, I do like new oak. So I'm not
Yeah.
someone for my Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. I'm like, oh, 0% new oak. It's like, no, I do appreciate what it does, but ultimately, because I'm not picking at, a high bricks, I can't really justify a heavy percentage new oak. So all those decisions kind of get compounded, and then you create your own style.
That's awesome. I think the ability to create up one's own style in any aspect of life is such a beautiful thing because you start with something and you start with a technique that you've been taught, but then you sit there and you go, but what if we did this? But what if we tried this? And those, but what if we did this lead to some of the most amazing discoveries, the most amazing pivots and directions that, we can find in any areas of life, whether it be, art or computer programming. Those what if moments are so beautiful. Like, I want to ask you this because you describe Nisi. How do I say it? Am I saying it wrong?
I say Nisi, you could
Nisi.
say in Ni it's so I say Nisi. Technically, I think it's Nisai 'cause the
Nice,
term
huh?
is in
Nisi.
Nisai. But Nisi, Nisai, Nisi, I picked it, because there's, the philosophical meaning behind it and what I've been able to, kinda adopt it towards. I also picked it 'cause, it's like, say it how you want it, It's just like,
Yeah.
I think sometimes with wine, you sit at a restaurant and you look at this menu, and sometimes people don't order wine because they're afraid to pronounce the name. They say, "Oh,
Right?
I'm gonna look foolish if I say this wrong." I think one of the big things we can do right now in the industry is kind of eliminate that sentiment. It's like, hey, there's no right or wrong way. I mean, obviously, there's the correct way, but let's, hey, you're trying to say it first, and then like,
Yeah.
then you learn. And then there's still some famous domains that, you take, 4 top Psalms and they'll say it differently.
Right? I still have a hard time saying the word terroir. I can't do French, man. I can speak Vietnamese, but I can do terroir. Man, I don't even know how to pull that off. But coming back to you talking about your wine. You describe it as not yet absolute and always evolving. As another philosophy student, I am reminded of the Japanese inso. One of the most beautiful things, I don't know if you know about the inso. The inso is this, for people who don't know, it is the brushstroke circle that Zen monks will attempt paint. And here's the wild thing, or draw. They are always, you try to draw a circle. It's never perfect, but the monks will always continue to draw a more perfect circle. And like, that's the refinement that they go through. And there's the realization that every single circle that was drawn was perfect, and so it's like you're evolving, yet not like absolute, but yet there's this beautiful moment that you're in the present. What does that philosophy mean to you? Not yet absolute and always evolving to you personally as a winemaker.
I love that you bring up Enso because on my label, the circles are Enso. It's digitally done, not via breaststroke, but we definitely took on that philosophy. And for winemaking and just my approach with the brand, it's about this constant pursuit of evolution in the sense that I don't want to get to a point where I make no changes. That being said, there could be a year where I make no changes, but that would be evolution.
Mhm.
It's like, so if I make no changes and it's just out of like I didn't have time or I didn't think or that's not evolution. But sometimes, and not to say you reach perfection, but sometimes by making no changes, you are still evolving because there's an evolution in patience, there's an evolution in trust, there's an evolution in like, well, I didn't necessarily have to make changes because Mother Nature made the changes for me. But what I do like to think about in terms of my brand and winemaking is like every year after harvest, I'm like, what went well? What didn't go well? What do
Mhm.
I feel like I could do differently? And then I come up with like
And
30 things I want to do differently. And then I have to dial it back and say, okay, well, I can't do 30 things next year and continue to build this. So, you make one or two changes, sometimes it might be three. And it's a challenge to myself. It's just to constantly learn, to be a student and to never not be a student. So I love tasting other wines. I taste my
Mhm.
wine a lot, but I'm a big fan of Burgundy. That's why I do Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. So I taste a lot of Burgundy. I don't just learn from tasting Burgundy. I also learn from tasting Cabernet here in Napa Valley. I learn from, tasting Champagne. I mean, I even learn from maybe just like a grocery store wine because you can still learn a lot from every single bottle you taste, even if you don't like it. And so the challenge I give to myself is, hey, let's try to keep learning. Let's be a student and then don't be afraid to ask. So I have asked a lot of other winemakers, hey, what are you doing? And
Mm.
so I'm a little bit of a nerd that way. And so there's things that I've done, and I will continue to do, or, make changes on that simply are due to me asking another winemaker, hey, what are you doing here? And okay, we have the conversation. And okay, I like your wine. I like this specific element. Okay, I'm going to try that.
Yeah. Today again, when I watched my daughter doing her class, she looked at her teacher and said, how did you become better? How did you become better at remembering things? And I was just like, wow. I was actually really proud right there in that moment. This goal to be better, and she knew instinctively, like a child does, is to find someone who might have that information and to get there. And it was asking this teacher who was someone who made her feel joy and happiness. It was powerful because we don't always recognize those moments that we can find a mentor and find people who can help us grow. I wanted to ask you about your winemaking. Two of my favorite grapes, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, are two of like the most expressive grapes in the world. What keeps drawing you back to those varieties, especially being in the Napa Valley where everyone is cab, 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 cab? You're working with Pinot and Chardonnay, which I love both of them, and they're so delicious. What takes you to those varietals?
Yeah, so my first internship was at Sainsbury and, Carneros, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay. So that imprinted on me. That, left a strong impression on my palate. But then I got into the cab world and, worked for some incredible wineries and under some phenomenal winemakers. And I got a palate for Cabernet and I was like, this is
Mhm.
awesome, and I could stomach it. And then I started looking at, okay, well, what gets me excited in terms of winemaking? Just, not paying attention to the economics of it, because that's a whole nother thing. What gets me exciting? And I was like, okay, Cabernet is interesting, but I don't want to say scary, but it's like, okay, I don't feel as inspired by the proposition of the Napa Valley Cabernet experience. Like, okay, I don't want to say it becomes formulaic, but it just kind of felt simple of what I knew I would have to do to make Napa Valley Cabernet. And when I started thinking about Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, it just felt to me, oh, I have a lot of opportunity here. I can go any different direction. I don't feel constrained. And so I just started tasting wine, from all different AVAs, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir here in California, and I landed on Santa Rita Hills. So I'm still based in Napa Valley, but I get my fruit from Santa Rita Hills and I actually make it down there. And I just felt like, okay, it's a cool climate, AVA. It's such a unique place to grow grapes, and the quality is just insane. And so I was,
Mhm.
like I just got enamored with the Chardonnay down there. Realized also Pinot Noir is pretty good too. And yeah, that's kind of how Nisi formed. Was like, okay, let me do Sanry de la Chard. Well, maybe do a little bit of Pinot too. Discovered I had a lot of fun making Pinot, so I've increased my production on Pinot Noir. And with those two grapes, I like working with them because they stress me out at different times. And I emphasize stress because like winemaking, you gotta have confidence. You gotta be, level of security in your decision making. But there's a lot of things that you have to process. And with Chardonnay, I set forth the conditions pretty early. My barrel program, basically I decide now for the fall. And right now I'm tinkering a little bit, but that is huge. It's like, what barrels am I going to use for fermentation? And then it gets to the picking decision. So you're out in the field, you're tasting whatever, but okay, you make your picking decision. I have my, process. I like to take a lot of solids into the barrels. I barrel ferment. So you whole cluster press, you go into barrel, and then you kind of just let fermentation go. And you got to be on top of it. It's not like I'm, asleep at the wheel, but there's a lot of patience. The stress comes when I have to taste, which will be in a couple of months. So post malolactic, I will be tasting and then deciding, okay, how I'm going to shape my wines for the shards. Also, it's like scary because I haven't tasted, since the juice, which was back in September. So you go from like, okay, the chemistry was good, but also, my palate loved where I was at. And then you trusting your instincts with your barrel regimen, and then you got to go taste the finished product. So that's it's like all of a sudden you're like, okay, 10 months of work. I hope it's good.
Right.
Pinot Noir, on the other hand, it's very stressful during harvest. It's like you nail that picking decision, and then you got to nail your extract. And I'm very hands on, and I work the wines pretty heavily, just trying to make sure I'm extracting a lot of flavor, a lot aromatic without too much power. I like soft, supple wines. And once I finish fermentation, which is like get it into barrel, get it to safety, finish malolactic, add some sulfur, very little. The wine's kind of done. I do a little mid racking during the aging cycle. Take it off the lees, go back in and do a little pre blend. So like my pinots are done. I'm just waiting to bottle in July. Now a lot can go wrong. I mean, it's not like I'm not dealing with stress there, but you got to trust your environment. You got to trust, the chemistry and the biology that you say, "Okay, the wine is good. It's safe. I'm checking all the boxes. I get it to bottle." So it's like, it's just two different world, the Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And it keeps me stressed the entire year.
That's wild, man. And I mean, it's interesting because I don't think people that are non-winemakers understand how two different grapes can have two different characters. But I think the one area that I recognize it the most is that I've been around a lot of dogs, and each dog breed is a little bit wild and different and neurotic. I had a pit bull who was the sweetest dog on the planet, but she had her triggers. Like if another dog would be snippy with her, she would go, "What the hell?" And she'd lose her cool. I have a border collie who's literally the most neurotic dog I've ever had. He's got social anxiety. He does weird things, but he's a sweetheart. I've got a poodle who's this big, but got the personality of a Great Dane, but she's also a sweetheart. But each of them is different. They behave differently. They work with you differently. They interact with you differently. And from every winemaker I've spoken with, it seems that there's a crossover there where the wines all have these different behaviors, and they can be 1 second a sweetheart and the next second your biggest nightmare. But they're always beautiful and powerful at the same time. But I want to ask you this, like, what's one varietal that you love to hate?
That's a tough question. Petit Verdot, and it's an operational answer is when you're destemming it. It's just not fun, and it is just it's tough to dial in on a destemmer, sorting it, and then it's so tannic. Now there's some very interesting 100% Petit Verdot wines out there. You don't see it often, and it's cool to taste, but it is a very tannic varietal, and you'll kind of see maybe like 2 to 3% in some of these wines here in Napa Valley, and it really does help the wines and really kind of give it character. But yeah, my background is more cellar driven. I was having to manage teams and be very operational. So my answer, leans more on the operational standpoint as opposed to, I am not a viticulturist. So I'm sure if you ask someone who's, farming, their answer is going to be different just simply on a farming perspective.
So interesting. When you walk a vineyard site for the first time, what are the subtle things that you're looking for that tell you whether the place has something special?
It's a feeling. It's just, it's like I like to hike, trail run, fun. So I spent a lot of time in nature. And sometimes you're out walking and you just like, you can kind of sense, is there another animal watching me? There's always that like sense. You
Mhm.
might not see it, but you might feel it. And I think humans were very intuitive. There's so much going on in our unconscious that, some of it we've maybe fed through conditioning, but there's so much that we're internally assessing that we might not be perceiving. And so when I'm in a vineyard, it really is just a feeling. Okay. And it's so I'm probably factoring the smell, the sounds, the sights, and then it just creates this energy that I'm like, okay, this is a special place. On a, more practical level, I look at the soil, I look at, the health of the vine, I look at, is there cover crop, I look at the aspect of the slopes. I like seeing rock, and I think that that's indicative of nice soil.
Yeah.
And then it's just, the ecosystem. I think that's huge. When you're feeling energy and life in the vineyard, you're like, okay, this is a special place. I think that's very important because, we talk so much, especially with California wine production, about the use of Roundup and pesticides. And I think it gets a kind of bad name because the usage is way less than perceive it to be. But you kind of know when you're in a site, you're like, this feels like Mars. You're like, I don't like this. You want it to feel alive.
That's beautiful, though. Every winemaker has a memory of a bottle that changed the way they thought about wine. Do you remember one bottle of wine that you tasted that you were like, "Oh, man, this is something special?"
Yeah, I've been fortunate to have just, I guess, been at the right tables. I would say the list of trophy bottles is long and incredible. And all those bottles carry such a special memory for me because of, it's the setting, it's who you're with. Obviously, they tasted good. The story behind the bottle, it's all a part of it. So it's hard to pick one, but I was lucky to have had the 1969 Chapelet, and that's a
Mhm.
benchmark wine for Napa Valley, Cabernet. And so I just feel lucky to have been able to have it among some great people, and it was just a special moment to just realize, okay, well, it's wine aged, it was alive, it was so good, and realizing that even back then when they had less knowledge than we do now and the equipment wasn't the same and the technology wasn't the same, they made an incredible wine that aged very well.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing that they were able to do the things they were. I got to work with a master leather craftsman, and I made a purse for my wife, and he trained with the people who train, like the people at MS. He trained under MS people, and like he was so amazing. And he measured everything. Of course, it was perfectly measured, but at the same time, there was just this. You would see them, and he'd just be feeling the leather, and he'd just be bending it, and just it was this language of speaking to this thing. I watched this one guitarist, this luthier, make a guitar, and just to watch him tapping the wood, and just he was measuring, but he was also just tapping after he cut, and shave off 2 pieces of wood, and then he'd tap, and he's just listening. And I just wanted to, like, God, I'd love to be a fly on the wall when he's doing that, going, "What are you listening for?" But it's something that he has refined over, years and years and years. And so it's so beautiful to me that people have that ability to do that. Even with all the science, there's still that thing that we are able to, that thing that human thing, that's so uniquely human. I want to ask you this. If you were to pour 3 glasses right now, what 3 wines would you choose?
Champagne, probably. I love Krug champagne. This is my go-to. I have a textural palate, so I just love the weight of that wine. So it would be champagne. It would be a white Burgundy. I have, like
Mhm.
list of 10 different producers and wines, but let's call it Grand Cru white Burgundy. And that's the inspiration for me. And yeah, probably Grand Cru red Burgundy. That's why I make Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, because I just love Burgundy so much. And yeah, I just love champagne. So those 3 wines.
That's awesome. It's really awesome, man. Where can people go to find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, so I have my website, nisiwines.com. That's probably the best source of information. I have Instagram, and that's really it. Try to keep it
That's
minimal,
awesome.
and I am available to answer any questions. I do like to make that clear to anyone who's interested in my wine and in my story, and all my customers. I give them my phone number. I say, hey, you could ask me anything. You can ask about my wine, but you can also ask me about a recommendation for another wine. I love talking wine and sharing that with people. So I make it clear that I'm here. I can answer anything you might ask me, and with my brand, it's just me. So Nisi Wines Wines a one-person show, and so I like to keep it that way, and I wanna make sure that, I think we're in a very experiential driven society right now, and so I wanna make sure that people feel that experience, is that it's very human, it's very personal. I think that's the way I operate, and that's a way I think the brand will speak to more people, is that realize that this is not a big company. It's one person. This is Adam's wine. I hope you like my wine, but everyone has different palates. So I make wine to appeal to my palate. And if you do like that wine, then great. Let's chat.